Okay, so I've seen a few claims in the IRI feedback groups that you haven't been given enough information about how to write an essay. I just want to point out, first of all, you all should have taken English 1A, so you should have had plenty of ideas about how to write an essay. And some of you may have been given the idea that essays appear in 5 paragraphs or something like that. This is something that if you do a little search here for 5-paragraph essay or the keyhole diagram, you're going to see a lot of stuff like this. And let's just talk about that for a minute. I posted several videos about this. I think if you haven't watched the video on the composition process that I posted just before this first IRI was due, you should take a look at that because it definitely goes back into detail about things that I've been talking to you about all semester. So here's one of the kinds of diagrams that some of you may have been introduced to when you were in high school, or maybe even in your English 1A class. I'm not sure about it, but it's definitely something I would actively argue against teaching students to think in terms of an essay as a simple formal structure. It doesn't really do any. Here's another one of it, the 5-paragraph essay. The idea that all you have to do is know what the formal structure of something and then you can just fill the ideas in is probably what's caused more people consternation and anxiety about writing than anything else. The idea that, and this comes, and with this you often get the notion, students, I've been hearing this for years, for more than 25 years, students getting the idea that I have to come up with my thesis, then I'll know how to write my essay. And the idea here is that as soon as you know what your thesis is, you just figure out the 3 parts that'll go into the different body paragraphs, and then you restate your thesis and you've got it all together. It's totally, that's totally the opposite of what academic discourse is really about. It's not about just filling in some vessel. What academic discourse is about, and which is what I've been focusing you people on all semester, is coming up with an interesting and important and useful question at issue. And this is just in this inquiry flowchart. This is not a formal structure for an essay at all, as you can tell. These are the steps that you would go through in these different boxes. And this is also what I've been talking to you about as far as this research arc goes. This is just the kind of direction that you go in. The way that you choose to order your thesis, your essay, has everything to do with the thesis that you come up with and with the work that you did to arrive at a conclusion. So let's go back through this one more time, and we'll talk about, just briefly, I want to talk to you about, again, about how really useless those the simple structural formal 5-paragraph essays are. It may be fine for somebody who has no sense of where they're going and just wants to fill something out so that they can present it as a product to somebody else to see whether they could follow in simple directions. But what I'm asking you to do, and what college and academic discourse is asking you to do, is to actually perform real inquiry. And so for inquiry, you need to be interested in something. You have to have a question about that thing, and all the sciences function in the same way. Humanities inquiry functions this way. You want to know an answer to a question. You have a problem, something that has arisen for you. You want to know more about it. You want to come to a conclusion about it. So you go through the process of inquiry. And what inquiry is simply asking the questions about that thing, about that question, that idea, that problem, until you come to a conclusion. Now I believe I know what I think about that. So that's a process that if you're taking if you're actively taking notes while you do this, if you come up with a question about, let's say, Teo's PTSD or what kinds of illness he has, or about Native American connections to animals in their stories, or about anything like that, and then you go back to the book, you should be writing notes to yourself as you start to answer those questions. The questions will keep coming to you until you get to a place where you feel like you understand your answer to that question. And that process, that's called inquiry. That's where you generate the material that will go into your essay. Okay, so let's go back to this. Here's the inquiry and research interest essay that I'm asking you to write. Here is the inquiry flow chart. So your initial questions should help you to narrow and focus your question at issue more. That should help you to find more specific and precise kinds of research source material. Those things should help you to answer these kinds of questions that will lead you eventually to your knowledge, your idea that you now know what you believe as an answer to that question. If you don't care about the thing that you're writing about, then I frequently notice that people don't bother to do very valuable research. They're really not sure why they're researching it. And when I worked in writing center situations with students over the many, many years, they would come in with those 5-paragraph theme essays where they'd been basically told, all you need to do is come up with a thesis, then figure out 3 parts to your thesis, then write a separate body paragraph for each of those parts with some of the development of supporting materials and the rest of that, and then restate your thesis and conclude something. It often has advice within it like have a good hook, something that will drag people in and the rest of that, and have something interesting to say at the end, use a quote. This is the kind of advice that doesn't necessarily help a person who doesn't really know why they're writing. The way I'm trying to get you to write is all about figuring out why you're writing. That's where you have to have something that interests you to start. So you go through this process. You take the notes till you get down to the point where you believe you know what you think. Then you should have, if you've been taking notes on this and writing to yourself as you go along, you really should have all the material that you need in order to put together the essay. So what are you doing when you put together an essay? You are really just explaining the process that you went through to come to a conclusion for a reader. So what does that mean? If we go back to the to the research arc. Here we are. We found out what we believe. We have to think about our audience, and sometimes thinking about our audience will send us back into more inquiry. If we say, oh, these people don't already know what I'm talking about, or perhaps there's gaps in the logic that you need to go back and figure out. So you may need to do, after you come to your thesis, you may have to do a little bit more inquiry, a little bit more further research. But once you really get it all together, it's time for you to put it in the right order. So what order should you put it in? Where should you begin? Well, it seems pretty simple and straightforward to me that the first thing you'd want to tell people is what you're writing about. So if before you can get to the question that you've generated through your own interests, you have to tell people about what are the background materials for that writing, it might take you two or three paragraphs before you can even get to your own question. There's no simple formula for this, really. I mean, some scientific articles do follow a very standard formula, but it's exactly the same formula that I'm talking about here, which is basically just you going through the process of inquiry, coming to a conclusion, looking back over the materials that you've generated that led you to that conclusion, and then figuring out the best order to put them into. So what does that mean? What is the best order? Well, in order to think about that, all you need to do is imagine yourself speaking to somebody who knows nothing about what you're writing about. Okay, so what's the first thing they need to know? They need to know the topic. They need to know what you're interested. They need to know why you have this specific question at issue. So all of those things get placed. It should be placed someplace in the beginning of an essay. Frequently people will say, well, what if I wanted to walk people through till I got to my conclusion and that happened at the end? That would mean that your thesis was coming at the end. And I've seen plenty of excellent articles written that way, where the writer takes you through till you arrive at the conclusion. You have been induced to walk down a path with them to come to the same conclusion. The reason why we often see thesis occurring someplace near the beginning of an article in academic discourse is because readers, professors, scholars, people who are working on the same discourse community, they want to know what a person's finding is up front. They want to know what's going to be happening in the rest of the essay. They want to know what the person found at the beginning. They don't feel like being held in suspense. There's no real reason to if you've already found the conclusion. So what you're doing is you're giving the background, talking about the interests that you have, the topic that you're writing about, the specific narrow focused question at issue, and then in a standard academic discourse, you're giving your thesis. You're telling them, this is what I found. The next several, and there's no reason why there should only be 4 more paragraphs. This is why the 5-paragraph theme makes absolutely no sense to me. It's fine if 5 paragraphs is what you need to make your argument. If 7 paragraphs is what you need to make your argument, write a 7-paragraph essay. If it's 4, whatever the number, all you're really trying to do is explain to somebody why you came to the conclusion that you did. And that's where you stop and think about the different parts that you should be able to figure out that there are separations in things. You're not just talking about one thing. There are probably different aspects to that thing. So that's where you break things up into their paragraphs. You have to figure out what is it the first thing that they need to know after your thesis, after you give people your conclusion. What's the first thing you need to know? What's the next thing after that, and after that, and after that, and after that? Okay, so this is really the idea, is that you should be thinking about what will happen in a reader's mind as he or she or they read the journey that you went on to come to your conclusion, and understand the materials that you found, the resources that you found, how things function together to come to allow you to come to the conclusion that you have. If you put those in a good order, if you do it in such a way that it explains it clearly and offers good supporting evidence to the person who's reading it, they will probably come to the same conclusion that you have, or at least they will understand how you came to your conclusion.